Module 26, The Late Yuan Painters. I, Dr. Rita Pratap, former head of the Department, Drawing and Painting, University of Rajasthan, Jaipur. I am going to speak on the late Yuan painters. It was the Chinese critics who gave the name the four great masters to Huang Kong-wang, Wu Chen, Ni Tisan and Wang Meng. After the death of the Kublai Khan, the effectiveness of the Mongol rule in China deteriorated sharply. The reign of the last Mongol emperor who succeeded to the throne in 1333 was an era of disturbance, and the inevitable revolts demoralized all classes of society. More than ever, educated men withdrew from official service and the public remained insecure, awaiting the re-establishment of peaceful conditions. The four masters too chose seclusion in the south, where they kept the lamp of the Confucian ethics and scholarship burning, setting an example in both their work and their private lives that later became the ideal of the secular painters of the Ming and Qing dynasties. In painting, they, all the four, with the partial exception of Wang Meng, took as their models Tung Yuan, Chu Jian rather than Li Cheng and Ku Hisi. They cultivated a deliberate plainness or blandness of brushwork, avoiding the technical refinements, the appeal of color and the spectacular in contrast indulged in by their contemporaries in the capital. The four great masters of the Yuan dynasty. It was the Chinese critique who gave the name the four great masters to Huang Kong-wang, Wu Chen, Ni Tisan and Wang Meng. After the death of Kublai Khan, the effectiveness of the Mongol rule in China deteriorated sharply. The reign of the last Mongol emperor who succeeded to the throne in 1333 was an era of disturbance, and the inevitable revolts demoralized all classes of society. More than ever, educated men withdrew themselves from official service and the public remained insecure, awaiting the re-establishment of peaceful conditions. The four masters too chose seclusion in the south, where they kept the lamp of the Confucian ethics and scholarship burning, setting an example in both their work and their private lives, then later became the ideal of secular painters of the Ming and Qing dynasties. In painting, they all the four, with partial exception of Wang Meng, took as their models Tung Yuan and Chu Jian rather than Li Cheng and Ku Hisi. They cultivated a deliberate plainness or baldness of brushwork, avoiding technical refinements, the appeal of color and the spectacular in contrast indulged in by their contemporaries in the capital. They no longer troubled to make their forms outwardly true to nature, as had Fan Quan and Ku Hisi, or to evoke a poetic or nostalgic mood, as had Ma Yuan and Hissa Kui. They preferred to paint on paper, no longer on silk. They used the monochrome of ink in contours and in textural brushstrokes and washes, which they could vary from deep black to light grey. depending on the amount of water in ink. Once more, their compositions were symmetrical or centrally placed. They had rejected the one-corner style of the Southern Shung period. Many of their pictures bore inscriptions that were intended to be part of the composition as a whole. The four were not a group like the circle around Su Shi and did not know each other personally. Only the art critic and historians of later centuries have grouped them together on the grounds of the features they shared mentioned above. Despite all attempts to see them as a school, they emerge as extremely individual artists. Huang Kung Wang. He was active from 1269 to 1354. Oldest of all the four great masters, was a native of Zhejiang, and like most men of his class, he was trained in government service. But he soon quitted his job to spend the rest of his long peaceful life as a yin shi, a retired scholar, in the Wu district of Zhejiang, talking, drinking, writing and painting in the company with Taoists, Buddhists and other so-called recluses like himself. As said by his contemporaries, Huang Kung Wang's heart was warm and generous, his understanding of history and philosophy profound. It is fortunate that his masterpiece, which had a greater influence and was more often copied than any other painting in the literary tradition, has survived in the Palace Museum collection Taichung. Dwelling in the Fuchun Mountains, dated to 1350, it is a section of a hand scroll, ink on paper in the National Palace Museum collection, Taichung, Taiwan. As Wu Chu puts it, no painter achieves this better than Huang Kung Wang, cool and reserved. His paintings represent for the Chinese the perfect expression of an ideal scholarly temperament. This is a work of his old age when he was already 79. It has been one of the influential paintings in China, copied and imitated by countless artists. Huang's own inscription on it contains an enlightening account of how such a picture was executed. He laid out the entire design, sketched the mountains and trees in one burst of creation. He added to it occasionally when his mood was right, and after 3 years of work in it, he decided it was finished. The hills and valleys of the Fuchun Mountains are famous beauty spots near Hangzhou. In the painting, he did not hesitate to correct a contour or paint trees over it, for he did not feel himself bound by the conventional rules and techniques. In the painting, the mountains appear as earthy, unimposing hills, with houses in the valleys between them and pavilions on the shore. The painting retains the freshness of the original conception and preserves the feeling of hazy, sunlit atmosphere that floods the scene. Today, some 60 works are ascribed to Huang. only a few of them undoubtedly by his hand. He liked to paint broad water meadows, mountains and tree-grown hill, with the composition guiding the observer's eye along a zigzag line from the background of the picture to the foreground and then into the background again. His works were inspired by his immediate involvement. In his theoretical writings, Mysteries of Landscape Painting, extant in an edition of 1366 kept by an admirer, he recommends painters always to carry sketching paper and brushes with them in order to make an instant record of effective and impressive motifs. It is said that he never went out without a sketching scroll himself. When he included an occasional human figure or a building in his mountain landscape executed in textural brushstrokes standing out against a wash, he portrayed them with naive and much simplified strokes. The emphasis is clearly on nature and not the work of human hands. Landscape is a symbol of eternity, although when Huang depicts atmospheric conditions or the influence of the weather, he also shows its phenomenon as changeable and fleeting. He found the depiction of light in particular a challenge and is one of the earliest artists to have been aware of the opportunities it presented. Wu Chen, he was active from 1280 to 1354. Wu Chen was the second oldest of the four great masters, poor by birth and unsocial by nature. He spent the whole of his quiet life in southern China. He made his living first as a diviner and later, when his reputation as a painter had spread, by presenting his pictures to his friends and receiving gifts in return, a practice unobjectionable to the literary artists who refused to work on commission and to subordinate his own taste of that of a patron. Wu Chen painted bamboo and landscape, usually inscribing on them poems of his own composition. The scenery of his landscapes to that of his home, the moist terrain of the Jiangnan region with his network of rivers, canals, its flatness broken only by modest hills. He said to have studied Tung Yuan so closely that his works were erroneously taken for authentic pictures by Tung. Wu Chen chases to like a diost recluse in the mountains of the modern province of Zhejiang. His favorite themes included fishermen in their boats and single coniferous trees. He relished texture, using broad strokes and depicting distant vegetation diffusely with dots, and he generally used wet ink. In his representation of nature and people, he clearly defines two opposite poles. Natural features are executed with broad strokes and wash. Lone fisherman on the river in autumn. This is a hanging scroll, ink on paper, belonging to Yuan dynasty and at present in the Palace Museum, Taipei. Like so many of the creative Yuan masters, he looked back to monumental landscape style of the northern Shung and specially to the powerful brushwork of Yuan. The sharp break between the foreground and the distant mountains on the far right, linked by that wide bare expanse of water, is more typical of Yuan masters. In detail, the brushwork is summary, sharp and bold, an end in itself. His best known work is The Fisherman. This is a section of a hand scroll, ink on paper, dated to 1342 and at present in the Freer Gallery of Art, Washington, D.C. Here he had depicted the ideal life of men who make their living by fishing. They are amateur anglers, scholars, enjoying their leisure. They sleep, admire the scenery, sing boating songs, but seldom fish. In place of rationality and complexity, Yuan offers institutional simplicity conveyed in coldly brilliant ink. His brush shorthand, epitomized by the Chinese as the single stroke style, combines rapid certainty with calculated but bold composition and deliberately rough representations. Perhaps the qualities that distinguished Wu from other three masters grew out of his love, his painting bamboo, which requires ultimate discipline of brushwork and effectiveness of each single stroke. An example is of a poetic feeling in a thatched pavilion, dated to 1347. It is a hand scroll, ink on paper, belonging to Yuan dynasty and at present in the Cleveland Museum of Art. Yuan lived next door to clever and popular Sheng Mao. It is said that one day his wife scolded him, saying that as compared to your neighbor, you lack success. But he replied, it will not be after 20 years. Certainly, Sheng Mao was never so popular as he was in his lifetime. Yuan's looser style, less obviously accomplished, is in the end more admirable. A 14th century writer characterized him as profound and remote, with a leisurely and relaxed feeling. Nitisan was active from 1301 to 1374. He was the third of the four great masters of the Yuan dynasty and a young friend of Huang Gongwang. Nitisan is accorded by most Chinese writers a rank almost equal to that of Huang himself. Born into a wealthy Jiangsu family of merchants, but his own interest was scholarly and aesthetic. In his youth, he became noted collector and antiquarian. Rare books, antiquities, calligraphy and paintings. In the last years of the fall of the Yuan dynasty, he dispersed his property among relatives and friends. He left his home to spend the rest of his life as a wanderer. He painted only when he felt inclined. Like Yuan, he never sold his pictures but would give them away to people who really appreciated them. In contrast with Yuan and Huang Gongwang, Nitisan forte is neither strength of brushwork nor intellectual consistency. He is preeminently a poet in paint and his style is delicate. His brushstrokes are specialized, long, thin lines to define rock or mountains, short delicate dashes for bamboo, or leaves or shrubbery or distant mountains. His compositions are characteristically simple, usually dominant rock, a few trees, a few sprigs of bamboo, sometime a pavilion, often a distant mountain, never a human being. A distinctive characteristic of Ni-Tizan's work is a kind of pictorial composition new to Chinese art, showing an empty, desolate view. In such compositions, in which are very sparing with narrative elements, often leafless trees in the foreground are the only visual link between the foreground itself, usually an embankment or sandbank, and the background showing mountains overgrown with vaguely depicted vegetation beyond a wide expanse of water. Strongly accentuated touches of ink, moss dots put the finishing touches to the composition. Ni did not cover large surfaces with dark ink and almost always used a dry brush. The dry brush technique earned him a reputation as a painter of particularly economic style, and it lends his work a light, bright appearance. The swirling vapor and banks of mist that are typical atmospheric features of the Shung paintings don't appear in the work of Ni-Tizan and other literati of the Yuan period. Portrait of Ni-Tizan, painted by anonymous painter, dated to about 1340. It is ink and paint on paper, and it is in the collection of Taipei Palace Museum. Here the painter and the theoretician Ni-Tizan, who had many artists' names in his career and was surrounded for half his life by the treasures of art and literature they had collected and to which he himself had contributed. In the painting, he is shown seated on a high raised square bed with folding scroll in one hand and a brush in the other. On his left, a table which is decorated with various kinds of vessels. At his back is huge screen with a landscape scene painted. On both his sides are male and female assistants standing. Ni-Tizan used ink, later critics said, as sparingly as if it were gold. Some of his hanging scrolls worth mentioning are Trees in a River Valley at Yushan, dated to 1371. It is ink on paper and at present in the C.C. Wang collection, New York. Other painting, Pines and Rocks, is a hanging scroll dated to 14th century and at present in the C.C. Wang collection, New York. In his painting, Zhong Hisi Studio, dated to 1372, a hanging scroll, ink on paper, belonging to Yuan dynasty and at present in the National Palace Museum, Taipei. The inscription on the upper part of the picture says that the studio belongs to a doctor friend for whom this picture was painted. But it is not an attempt to depict the doctor's studio itself. The conventional empty pavilion was placed in the picture merely as a hint that this quiet spot was occasionally visited by the doctor and his friends. This austere composition with a river bank and a few trees in the foreground, distant hills in the background, and an empty middle ground representing a broad expanse of water demonstrate a manipulation of landscape element that is not overly concerned with depicting any formal likeness of the real world. Later scholar painter admired Nitisan's style to imitate his compositions and technique. Wang Meng, he was active from 1309 to 1385. The fourth and youngest of great Yuan master was Wang Meng and nephew of Chao Mengfu. Meng was passionate and single-minded painter whose integrity in the pursuit of his aims inspired Nitisan to say, "There has been no one equal to him for 100 years." His most original contribution to pictorial composition is the ranging of many layers of landscape behind each other in the background, conveying an impression of unusual spatial depth. He also painted elements such as rocks and even the trees of the foreground in a very precisely structured detail. In many of his mountain compositions, scarcely a scrap of paper is left vacant, although in scenes including sketches of water, a free area was imperative to depict the surface of water. The characteristic of his style are his many tones of ink, muted shades of water, and extremely inventive and varied brush strokes, curving, straight, shortly horizontal and vertical. His use of fine lines and dots and the hemp fiber, textural strokes all over them, providing the dynamic element in his work. He painted the wide range of subjects, however, and to group him with other three great masters does not entirely do him justice. His painting Thatched Halls on Mount Tai, Ink and Paint on Paper, Hanging Scroll, and in the collection of Tai Pai Palace Museum is a good example of Wang Meng's command of wide variation and changing direction of his lines. His view of the thatched hills show an extensive estate in the rugged mountain landscape. From the Tang period at least, the thatched hut, cow tongue, was a poetic symbol of life in seclusion, but with positive and life-affirming rather than negative connotations. Particularly interesting is Wang Meng's interpretation of the contrast between mountain and valley, wild and domesticated nature, a reinforced bank, huts and fences, and the group of pines in the middle of the foreground emphasizes the division between them. The buildings are rather sketch-like and are not depicted in detail. The pavilion with its view of the waterfall on the lower left edge of the picture is a favorite pictorial element defining a landscape as an extensive piece of landscape gardening in the widest sense. Pavilions prominently placed to attract the eye or give view are typical of the buildings to be found in a natural setting redesigned by man. Thus, the four masters and the four different concepts of landscape painting show us how they experienced landscape. It is still true to say, as Siren cogently wrote, that while they all were romantics from the aesthetic point of view and expressionists or idea writers, from the technical viewpoint, they were all individualists in their use of brushes and ink. The eternal search for the soul of nature reflecting the temperament of the artist. All of them eccentric in their views of life became the subject of their painting. The life of each was reflected in his art. They walked in the mountains, traveled along the rivers, observed the clouds, the changes in the atmosphere, listened to the wind and water, and recorded them as pictorial symbols of nature poetry. The economical pictures of the first three show that the general tendency was towards simplification. Wang Mang, with his dislike of emptiness, was exception. However, Wang stood on the threshold of the next dynasty in loose connection with a group of painters who composed mighty dynamic mountain views deriving from originals of the 10th and 11th centuries. As an exponent of this style, Wang was copied until well into the Qing dynasty. Like most other Yuan painters, he professed a dependence upon northern Shung and earlier landscapists. Chinese critics, in analyzing his style, find affinities with Tung Yuan in the fiery texture of his surfaces, or with Ku Hisi in the ribbing rocks and cliffs of some of his crowded compositions. Towards the end of his life, he was innocent victim of a political intrigue, and he died of cold and hunger in the prison. Forest dwellings at Chuchu. It is a hanging scroll, ink and color on paper, and at present in the Palace Museum collection, Taichung. It is a remarkable picture and the work most complex and congested. Textual analysis and variations are the staples of his style, which was somewhat tidied up in the numerous works after Wang Mang by later well-renowned painters. Here, trees, houses, and figures are drawn with the same childlike simplicity and charm as they are in the most restrained of Wang Mang's work. Thatched Lodge in Autumn Hills. This is a 14th century hanging scroll and at present in the collection of National Palace Museum, Taichung, Taiwan. This picture is an attempt to explore the new forms and shapes of living nature and to evolve the technique to express what he felt. These dynamic compositions by Wang Mang retain elements of monumentality. Textual analysis and variations are the staples of his style, which were taken up by numerous artists. Nevertheless, his style greatly influences later Chinese paintings, and in some ways he stands the most original and creative artist of the four.